Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're excited that you could all join us online and in person for our conversation on fierce vulnerability. I'm Pele Shalev, the Public Events Specialist for CIIS Public Programs. We're here today at the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco, on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. As a representative of CIIS, I want to express our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. It is lovely to see those of you who are gathered here in this room and to share space with all those who are joining us online and watching this conversation from all over the world. This acknowledgement I made is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. If you're joining us online, I invite you to share in the chat where you're calling from. To learn more, we recommend the website native-land.ca as a starting resource. Before we start, I'd like to cover a few troubleshooting items. We will have a live Q&A after the conversation tonight. Since this is a hybrid event, we have a hybrid Q&A process so that our online and in-person guests all have the same chance to participate. Those of you who are in the room will find QR codes linking to the Q&A form in each seat. Online, you'll find that link in the event description below this video. We'll gather questions for our presenters from there at the end of the conversation, and we will try to get to as many as we can. For those of you online, chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacts your experience in any way. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Kazu Haga and Deanna Jimenez, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Deanna Jimenez is a somatic transpersonal psychotherapist and assistant professor in the somatic psychology department at CIIS. Her clinical work is centered on the dialogue of mental health as it intersects with race, culture, and spirituality. Through personal awareness, growth, and healing, Deanna guides individuals and groups in cultivating a solid mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual foundation as a pathway towards elevating collective consciousness without perpetuating the oppressive harm built into current societal structures. Kazu Haga is a trainer and practitioner in nonviolence and restorative justice. He weaves spiritual practice and trauma healing with the lineage of nonviolent social change to bring about transformation. He is the author of Healing a Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm, and Fierce Vulnerability, Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. And now, it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Kazu Haga and Deanna Jimenez.
Hi, good to see you all. And hello.
Hi, how's it going? Here we are.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so good to be here.
We spoke about how interesting it is being in the Bay, yet meeting for the first time and knowing all of these connections where we could have met. But it's really an honor to be having this talk with you and really deepening into your work and your book.
Likewise. Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this.
As we begin to explore insights from your work in restorative justice, I wonder if it'd be okay if we orient with our bodies, minds, and hearts. That is really central to the book as well. So Is there a practice you could bring that you'd be willing to offer for all of us here and online to ground into the space?
Yeah, so we just thought we would start with like a very brief practice period. And yeah, for those of you that are watching online and for those of you listening to the podcast later, I really want to invite you into this as well. And so if you feel comfortable, if you want to just gently close your eyes wherever you might be. And I noticed that for myself, the moment that I close my eyes and turn my attention inward, in this immediate moment, right away I feel some pain in my lower hips. I also feel the heat on my chest with the fabric of my shirt touching it. I feel the weight of my hat on my head. Just inviting everyone to take just a few moments to see what you notice is present right now in this moment in your body as you turn yourself inward. And as you begin to notice sensations, maybe tension, maybe spaciousness, maybe lightness, just seeing what those areas of your body might need and allowing your body to move, to sway, to stretch. You can stretch your arms, turn your neck, whatever it might be that gives your body a little bit more spaciousness. Just listening to the wisdom of your body and knowing that you know exactly what you might need in this moment. Then finding yourself settling in to a stable position with your head held high. One of my teachers oftentimes calls a dignified position. Dignified might look differently for each person. Just sitting up in a way that feels dignified to you. And taking a couple of deep breaths. Knowing that we've been breathing our entire lives since we've come out of the womb, but too often we don't actually practice breathing. And so as we begin to turn our attention to our breath, just making sure that we're taking deep breaths in through our nose and breathing out as slowly as you can, knowing that it is in the slow exhales that our nervous system regulates, that our bodies calm down. Imagine your body stretching out towards the heavens with each in-breath. Your energy grounding to the ground with each exhale. Using your breath to really stretch out your body, creating more and more spaciousness in your body for whatever might be present for you. Sensing your body's cavity expanding, creating more and more space with each breath. Feeling the space between each vertebrae expand with each in-breath. And just taking this moment to appreciate your body, appreciate your presence, to appreciate your spirit for showing up, for being here in this moment. You feel ready, gently blink your eyes open. Begin to look around the room. Notice who's here. Noticing the shapes, colors, the plants. Thank you for arriving here.
Thank you. They say in the body that anxiety and excitement show up similarly, right? Breathing high versus in the belly, maybe moving thoughts. The only difference is that with excitement, there's breath. So I'm really excited to be here. And it really feels also important that when we are entering into conversations that are potentially activating or that are, as we're exploring liberation and systems or conditions that hold back on that, that we are actually bringing in our fullness. So thank you for guiding us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm trusting that online and in person that folks are coming in from different angles of the conversation. Some may be wanting to be in dialogue, others may be looking for guideposts for how to be in action. And so I'm wondering if we can begin with first contextualizing. What are some, oh, I thought I heard that something, sorry. What are some definitions, maybe specifically around the title of your book, Fierce Vulnerability, Beloved Community, Collective Liberation, whatever things that you feel important to define and contextualize to begin?
Sure. It's funny that I've been doing nonviolence trainings in some capacity since I was 19 years old. I'm 44 now, so however long that is. And I still don't really have a clear definition for nonviolence, but I feel like we should start there because that's so much of the lens through which I view the world. For me, when I talk about nonviolence, I oftentimes talk about how I think the biggest misunderstanding of the idea of nonviolence is that as long as I'm not throwing a Molotov cocktail when I'm at a demonstration, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And I think that's a really dangerous misunderstanding because if that's our understanding of nonviolence, then you could make the argument that a Ku Klux Klan member is practicing nonviolence when they are at a Ku Klux Klan march, because at least in the moment that they're at the march, they're not throwing Molotov cocktails. They're not engaged in physical acts of violence. But to me, nonviolence means something entirely different. To me, nonviolence is this unwavering belief in our interdependence. I oftentimes hear in a lot of activist communities, like, talk about beloved community. Beloved community is this term that's become more and more popularized over the years. And you hear it a lot in progressive movement spaces. And when I talk to people about what they mean by beloved community, oftentimes I hear things like, oh, well, beloved community is my faith community. It is my activist community, my friends, my family. And I always want to challenge people to think a little bit more because to me, building beloved community is not about loving the people that are easy to love. It's not about loving the people that are already in your community. The work of building beloved community is about us doing our own work so that we can expand our idea of who is part of our community and to really realize that, the universe doesn't weave separate webs of interdependence based on political affiliation, right? Like if we are like in an interdependent world, then we are interdependent with all life. There is no outside of beloved community. And especially in a world like today where there's so much polarization, there's so much violence happening, that's a really tough pill to swallow. To know that my liberation is bound with the liberation of all people. But I think that is the work of nonviolence. I think it is the work of building beloved community. I think it is the work of collective liberation to do the healing work that we need so that we can at least remember, even as we might be angry at someone, even as we might be challenging that person with the actions that they're doing, that we are holding them as a member of beloved community, as a member of that collective liberation, that I won't be liberated until all people are. And so I think that's like the central like theme of nonviolence, of beloved community, of fierce vulnerability, of collective liberation is really reminding ourselves that we belong to each other.
Mm-hmm. And even as you say that, I begin to, my heart beats faster because there's this question that I hold and I'm often grappling with how to hold this nonviolence while also feeling the threat.
Yeah.
What do you say? Yeah, how do you answer that?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of threats right now. One of my most important teachers in my life. His name is Bill G. He's an incarcerated nonviolence trainer in Soledad State Prison. He said this thing to me once. He said, resolving conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling conflict is about repairing relationships. And so often in our society, in our social movements and whatever, we only think so far as to how to fix the issue. So what is the legislation that we need to pass? What is the CEO that we need to kick out of office? What is the new politician that we need to elect? And that's important because fixing issues is the realm where we can like stop the immediate harm that is happening. That matters. That is really important. We need legislative change. We need to, abolish all these different institutions, whatever it might be. But at some point, if we're not also working on healing the relationships between the communities that are at odds, that give rise to all of these injustices, that give rise to this conflict, then we're always going to be spinning our wheels. It's going to be, it's just a matter of time before a new conflict, a new injustice erupts. And so I think it's really like so much of nonviolence is there's a old activist named Barbara Demings who wrote about the two hands of nonviolence, which I write about in the book.
Yeah.
And she says nonviolence is about learning to balance the power of the no hand. And she says, with this hand, we say no to injustice. We will refuse to pay for your bombs. We refuse to pay for the walls. We refuse to cooperate with you. With this hand, we will even disrupt the easy pattern of your life. But at the same time, the practitioner raises the other hand, and it's always outstretched, sometimes with loving compassion, sometimes not, but it's always outstretched. And with this hand, we say that we will never give up on your dignity. We recognize your humanity, and we know that you can make better choices than you're making now. And I will be here for you when you are ready. And so I think so much of the work of nonviolence is balancing the fierceness that we need to stop the violence, to stop the injustice that is happening right now, but to not let go of the vulnerability and the potential for love and connection that the yes hand offers.
I'm soaking that in. A few things that you said that stick out to me is one, relationship being the center, and these two hands. And I was really holding that in your in the title of your book, Fierce Vulnerability, this paradox, and how to be, you use the word balance, how to be in balance. You do a really phenomenal job in all that you write about to find that balance between theory and action, theory and personal examples. There's a bringing yourself into the book and also into the work. And I wonder if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, so much of this work it's like lessons that I've learned or like questions that have emerged for me around social change that have come out of my own healing journey, right? I talk about this experience that I had when I was, I don't know, it was 2012, I think. It was early on in my own personal healing journey. And around that time, I started to realize, I came from a household that had a lot of violence and abuse when I was growing up. And I realized as an adult that I had a little bit of shame for not being there more for my mom and my sisters when they were experiencing so much harm in my family. I was 12 years old when a lot of the violence started, and I just I shut down and I stopped coming home. I started getting high, started drinking, and I just stopped coming home. And so, like looking back at it, even when I started to explore it as a young adult, intellectually I knew that I was just 12 years old. I was just doing the best that I can to survive. I could give myself a lot of compassion. But I also started to feel like, oh, I actually have some shame for not having been able to do more to protect my family. And I was at this gathering called a jam, which is these like week-long transformative experiences that I read about throughout the book. And people were sharing vulnerable stories from their lives because jams are one of the most transformative spaces I've ever been to. So there's a lot of vulnerability that is shared. So I was like, all right, I'll share a vulnerable thing. I've been thinking about the shame that I have, but at the time, most of how I was holding that story was, oh, this is something that happened 20 years ago. It was really difficult then, but I'm over it now. I'm so glad I've healed from it. I spent a year living in monastery. Like I'm doing all this activist work. I've moved on. I'm good, but it's still a little vulnerable. So let me tell the story. So I spoke about this story for the first time out loud. and my body went into complete panic, and I could barely breathe. Um, and I was just crying and crying and crying. And, that moment taught me so many things. Amongst them was how big of a delusion I was living in, saying that, oh, this happened 20 years ago. Enough time had passed. I've gotten over it. I'm healed. And the reason I'm sharing this story is because I realized at some point that there's a similar dynamic that is happening with like racial injustice in this country, where we have this tendency to say, oh, slavery, that happened hundreds of years ago. Genocide of indigenous people, that was like centuries ago. We're so glad that that's over now. It was a really difficult time, but we don't need to talk about it anymore because it's over. And I think, we tell ourselves this story collectively that because it happened hundreds of years ago, we've healed from those wounds. But that's not how trauma works, right? Like, it's not how trauma works at the individual level, and it's not how trauma works at the collective level. And so through these experiences, one of the key kind of theses in my book is this idea that the universe is built on fractals. So the same way that trauma impacts my body as an individual, it impacts our collective body as cultures, as families, as nation states, as a species. And so, there's a lot of things that we've learned over the last couple of decades about how to heal trauma at the personal and interpersonal level. And I'm trying to apply those lessons to scale to look at our collective traumas and looking at injustice as a collective wound that we can heal.
Powerful. Yeah. Um, you've said so many things in there. One was the delusions, and I want to get to that because you also write about that, and that felt really powerful. But since you brought in fractals, let's go for it.
Let's do it.
Let's go for fractals because, well, maybe I just open it up to, well, I'll say what I wrote.
Oh.
What I wrote a lot. Can you say more about your connection that you're making around fractals,
Yeah.
trauma, and healing?
Yeah. So, I think we all know at this point that fractals are these geometric patterns that repeats itself over and over and over again. And you see them throughout nature, right? You see them in nautilus seashells. You see them in succulent plants. You also see them in what are called dust devils. There's like little tiny tornadoes almost that we see when you're driving down the side of a particular dry area.
Right.
There's a certain dynamic that creates a dust devil. And when you zoom out of the fractal, you look at a tornado, and it's the same thing that's happening at a larger scale. And then if you look at a picture of an eye of a hurricane, it's actually the same shape that it's creating. And then if you think about how planets rotate around its sun, it creates the same pattern. And then if you look at a picture of the galaxy, you see that it like the way that a galaxy rotates around the center of its axis, it creates the same pattern. And it's that no matter how small or how large the scale, because I believe that fractals are just a universal law of nature. It is the very nature of how this universe is structured. The same pattern repeats itself. And so why would that not be the case with the way that our bodies react to harm and violence and injustice and healing? One of the things that we know from, well, I've been in a lot of activist movements, which is about creating systemic change. And a lot of one of the like the $1 million questions in my book is activist movements oftentimes move with this energy of we are here to shut things down. And especially in a world like we are living in today with so much harm and violence, like there are systems that we need to shut down. And at the same time, we know that shutting things down is not an effective response to healing trauma. Like, you would never go to a traumatized person and point your fingers and say, you need to stop what you're doing. It might be effective in fixing issues, right? Like, it might temporarily get that person to stop doing what they're doing.
Right.
But if your goal is healing, that is never going to work. And yet in our social change movements, we move with this energy of we're here to shut things down because we don't realize that when we're engaged in social change work, we're trying to do the same work that we are doing with interpersonal healing, just at a larger scale. And so we think it's effective to like shut people down. But one of the things that I want to see in social movements is a movement that understands that injustice is not a political issue, it is a manifestation of our collective trauma. And so if we can see injustice as a manifestation of collective trauma, then can we build movements that understand that we can't shut down injustice any more than we can shut down trauma? And if we can understand systemic violence and injustice as manifestations of our collective wounding, then how would we build our movements differently? How would we respond to them in a way that has the power to stop the immediate harm, but is also working towards healing?
Right, right. The image that I get was like, yes, you can stop something immediately by shutting it down, but if we're speaking of fractals, it also has its ripple effects.
Exactly.
So how are then the after effects being perpetuated and going to resemble that initial shutdown? So the question, I mean, maybe backing up is if this is our action of shutdown, trusting that that will be the ripple effect action.
Yeah.
I picture like in a speedboat, if we're in a speedboat, there is the motor underwater, and this is probably, I'm paralleling it in psychology of like the core wound, that underwater, the motor is the one guiding the boat. But if we are just addressing the wake, well, how effective is that?
Right.
We actually need to be tuning to and shifting the motor, which is actually driving the boat.
Yeah.
Is that,
No, I love that.
Yeah.
And like shutting things down is like, it's much easier and it has this like immediate impact, right? Like if a person is acting out of their trauma,
Yeah.
to shut them down and to lock them up or whatever is immediately effective in stopping that behavior, but it does nothing to heal the wound that gave rise to that action, those choices that this person is making, right? And
At
so
all.
again, like if our only goal is to fix issues, then shutting down might be effective. But if our intention is the healing of trauma, the healing of relationships, then we need to be utilizing other strategies and other tactics. And what does that look like at scale in a world that is falling apart, right? That is like I make it very clear in Fierce Vulnerability, like I don't know, like I don't have any of those answers, but it's a lot of the questions and experiments that we're running.
Those questions are important though.
Yeah.
And yeah, I want to go to what you began the chapter, Living in a Fractal World, with a quote from Bell Hooks that kind of brings it all together. You said, Bell Hooks said, I have seen that we cannot fully create effective movements for social change if individuals struggling for that change are not also self-actualized or working toward that end. When wounded individuals come together in groups to make change, our collective struggle is often undermined by all that has not been dealt with emotionally.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
There's a accountability and a ownness of how we shift the train, stop the train, shift the trajectory, and coming back to, wow.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Forward to that.
yeah, there's so much to that and so many ways in which our unhealed traumas impact our ability or lack thereof to create long-term systemic change.
Right.
There's the obvious, like if I have unhealed trauma, then I'm bringing that unhealed trauma into my movement spaces and our movements are less effective because we're always fighting with each other. But also, you know, like when I had that moment at that first jam that I went to, um, one of the things that I realized in that moment was like, oh, I need to have a conversation with my family about our early childhood trauma. And if I'm going to heal my wounds, if I'm going to heal the wounds that still exist in my family, we need to have that conversation. And that was the scariest conversation I could think to have in that moment. And it took me 8 years of therapy and meditation retreats and going to more jams and all this work to build up the courage and the capacity to initiate that conversation with my family. And it was the scariest thing in my life. And if we are going out into the world, pointing our fingers and demanding racial justice and racial healing, what we are essentially asking is that our collective body begins to unpack and have conversations about some of the earliest wounds as that we have collectively.
That
And
have
so like
not been
that have
discussed
not been discussed.
or acknowledged.
And so if I have not done my own shadow work and be willing to look at my own core wounds, then I am in no position to point my fingers and say, I am demanding that we collectively do this. And so I think the more, and I've experienced that, I'm so far from healed. Healed is not like a destination, right? But as I've continued to go deeper in my own healing journey, I have this like embodied understanding of what healing takes and what it looks like. And if we don't understand what healing means in our own bodies, then we are not going to be able to be effective agents of change in trying to bring healing out into the world.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think bell hooks and the Buddha and Jesus and all these people have always said that, right? That like, if we don't understand what change looks like in our own bodies, then good luck trying to build a movement that is trying to demand that of the outside world.
Which also speaks to what you're saying around that core wound.
Yeah.
There is a book, The Body Keeps the Score. So we can know, but there is a knowing
right.
to develop. And that is the journey, not a destination of really being able to develop that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. One thing that was really heartwarming in the same chapter around fractals was also, you said the same way that this trauma perpetuates, so, or, shows up in fractals, so does healing. And that feels important to continue like titrating between what feels egregious and harmful while also knowing what we're seeing, the polar opposite also exists. And I wonder if you can speak more to that, because that felt like important to hold, again, as we're holding paradox.
Yeah, there's a lot that I could say to that. Yeah, like if the universe is built on fractals, then it means that the changes that are possible at the smaller scale are also possible at the larger scale. This is one of the things that Adrienne Marie Brown talked about, right? But the same kind of principles and the strategies that guide personal healing at the smallest scale also has to apply at the larger scale. And it's one of the main theories of fierce vulnerability. One example that's not in the book, because it's an insight that I had just recently that I've been thinking a lot about, is I have an aunt. She was my favorite aunt when I was a kid. She was like my hippie aunt, my cool hippie aunt. And over the last 10 years or so, she's become like a climate change denying Trump supporter. And it's this weird, like, there's this whole world of like, mostly like spiritual progressive folks that have gone to the far right over the last decade or so. And she's one of these people. And when I talk to my mom and my other aunts about it, they're all basically like, forget about her. Like, she's gone. There's no use talking to her. Definitely do not engage with her about anything political. And it's hard because she's always sending me links to these like YouTube videos that I should watch about how climate change is a hoax and all these things. And I think about my commitment to nonviolence. And nonviolence is about learning to engage with conflict, right? And it's about learning to speak truth to conflict. And so when I think about how I engage with her and the truths that I want to communicate with her, the first truth that comes to my mind is going. I imagine myself like going to her and being like, "Your understanding of climate data is wrong." That is true, I believe. And it would be like this like fierce like you are wrong conversation. And at the same time, I can imagine how that conversation would go. And when I ask myself, like, is there a deeper truth, a more vulnerable truth that I could express to her? What emerges is something that sounds a little bit more like, you used to be my favorite aunt, and I grieve the relationship that we don't have anymore. And I'm worried about you, that all of our family members are deserting you and you are becoming more and more isolated. And I don't know what's going on in your life that you are valuing these things more than your family relationships. And like, what happened? That is a much more vulnerable truth. it's a much harder truth for me to express to her.
Yes.
And it requires me to do some work on my end so that I can have that conversation with her. But it's a conversation that I feel like is much more likely to not shut things down, but open things up, right? It has a much larger possibility for connection and transformation and healing, while also not allowing her to continue to spew all these delusions that I think are hurting people. And so that to me is what fierce vulnerability looks like at the interpersonal level. And so again, like how do we scale that up when we're organizing a political demonstration or an organizing campaign? Instead of moving with this, we are here to shut things down because you're wrong and we're demanding this piece of legislation. Are there deeper, more vulnerable truths that we can lead with? Because in my experience, the moment that one person models vulnerability, it just opens up possibilities for transformation and healing and connection that weren't there before. And so, what would it look like to lead a demonstration instead of saying we're here to demand this, to lead with something that sounds more like I am here because I'm scared. I'm here because I'm scared for the welfare of my child. I'm scared because of the impact that all these issues are having on my community. Obviously, there's a long lineage of movements that have always led with that kind of message, but I guess I'm curious, what are the possibilities that opens up when we lead with vulnerability more than leading with this message of like, you are wrong and I am right?
As you're saying that, there's also one thing I appreciated, which settled my nervous system in the book, was that you often come back to there are layers. Like one is the vulnerability, another is a hard stop and, shutting down. So there's something around giving a sense of freedom. As I was reading, I was really trying to find like, what are these qualities of that? What are these qualities you're speaking to? One, you speak to vulnerability. You keep speaking to relationship. And I wonder if you can also bring in this curiosity that you keep bringing in here and that you have in the book. Like, I don't have the answers. I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think the subtitle of the book is, what is it, healing from trauma emerging through collapse.
Let's see. Yes.
Right, yeah. We went through multiple edits of that, but so part of the book is like acknowledging the moment that we are in as a species, and that we are in this moment where we're facing social, ecological, economic, political collapse. All these systems are in a state of collapse, and what does it mean to be doing healing work in the context of that? What does it mean to be able to cultivate curiosity in the midst of that? And I think one of the things that got us as a species into this mess, into this like place that we are in, where all these systems are in a state of collapse, is the worldview that if I think long and hard enough, then I will be able to figure out like all of the steps between here and liberation.
Right.
Right. And I love this idea that I read from this book, Reinventing Organizations, years ago, where the author was talking about the difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex. And he says that the engine of like a 747 jet plane is a complicated piece of machinery. There's thousands of pieces and gears that go into it. And if you remove one gear, you can use logic to map out all of the impacts that change is going to have on the system. Whereas a bowl of spaghetti might only have 3 ingredients, but if you start pulling on one strand, you have no idea how it's going to impact the system. And he says that the world that we live in is not a complicated place, it is a complex place. And there's no way for us to understand all of the impacts that our actions are going to have, and therefore no way to understand how we build this like work plan towards liberation. And I think so much of the work that we need to do is to remind ourselves that we live inside of a complex living organism, and we have very little control over the large changes that are happening on this planet, and to just accept the vulnerability and the humility of saying we have no idea what it's going to take to turn this ship around. In fact, there's probably nothing we can do to turn the ship around, but that's not going to stop us from doing something to try to continue to create community, to create beauty, to affirm life. And so I think that's a lot of what fierce vulnerability is trying to tap into as well, of the humility to say we don't have any of the answers. We actually don't know what to do, but we're going to try to do something anyways, as a way to try to move towards beauty and life and connection and relationships.
You coming back to what you said earlier around delusions, and that is one of the delusions you name around knowing.
Yeah, the delusion of knowing.
The delusion of knowing, because what you're saying is not only is it crazy making to think that we will map this entire path out, but there's something around we are creating from the level of consciousness of where we're at. So that's also assuming that we're not going to grow in some way along the path.
And it's important to have like the long-term vision, right? But
Definitely.
there's another thing that I read once that says like a farmer has a vision of what they want their farm to look like 20 years from now, and they know the thing that they need to do tomorrow, and everything else is about like sensing and responding, right? So I think a lot of fierce vulnerability is about like my intuition is saying that we need to do this next step, and then the step after that will emerge once we do that step,
Right.
right?
The word that comes up for me, which is also a thread in your book, is the trust.
Yeah.
How do we trust this process? And with fractals, if we're doing like your description of the farmer 20 years out while also trusting, the map is not the territory. So I have this map, but the territory is like, if I'm driving to LA, it's not a squiggly line. I'm going to go up a hill, downhill. That's not all mapped out. And how could I ever know that? And I really miss a lot.
Yeah,
If
totally.
I tried to know it
Yeah.
and miss the opportunities in my knowing.
Howard Zare once said that restorative justice is a compass, not a map. I think it's a similar concept, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. I'm still holding this thread of qualities of being engaged, because I guess that's what I really hold, is like, how do we move from the knowing, or a lot of folks are using the word decolonize or collective, beloved community, but how does that look individually? And another word that comes up for me is forgiveness. I was really struck by the story you shared in that chapter.
Cynthia and Richard.
Yes, and I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So, one of the greatest privileges I've ever had is the opportunity to work with incarcerated people and survivors of significant harm. And many years ago, I had an opportunity to work with this woman named Cynthia. Actually, there's a woman that works at CIIS, Sonia, who got me involved in doing a lot of restorative justice work. And through her organization, the Ahimsa Collective, this woman, Cynthia, reached out to us because she wanted to have a dialogue with the man who was responsible for taking her son's life. And so me and my co-facilitator, Bonnie, drove up 3 hours from Oakland to meet with this woman for the first time. And she was amazing. Like, I don't know what spiritual work you need to do to have that amount of compassion and clarity after losing your son to violence. But we met with her, and then we met with Richard, who is one of the men convicted of murdering her son. He's currently serving a life sentence in Old Folsom State Prison. And we worked with both of them individually for about 6 months to prepare to bring them together. And I will never remember the day that dialogue happened, where we brought Cynthia into the prison, and we sat her down and we kind of settled her into the room that the dialogue was going to happen. And I went around the corner to the holding tank where Richard was being held, and he was already shaking, and so I sat down, I put my hand on his shoulder, and I was talking to him, and at some point it was like, all right, I'm as ready as I'll ever be. He stood up and went around the corner, and when he turned the corner, he saw Cynthia in the room at the end of the hall, and he just completely broke, like he just collapsed. And he was crying and crying, and Cynthia saw that, and from the end of the hall, she stood up and just like opened her arms and embraced Richard in this hug that felt like it lasted for hours. And then they just talked for 6 hours straight. The only thing that Bonnie or I said throughout the entire 6 hour journey is about 4 hours in, Bonnie said, "Do you all need a break or anything? Like, do you need water, bathroom?" And they just talked. And there was this moment where Cynthia was holding Richard's hands, and she said, I had a dream that I needed to hold your hands because these are the hands that took my son's life away, and I need to have a different relationship with them. And then there was another moment when she was talking to him. They're both indigenous and grew up in this small rancheria in Northern California. And Mitch, Cynthia's son, used to play baseball, and Richard played baseball on the same team. And so Cynthia said, I remember when I used to drive Mitch to baseball practice, every time I'd see you walking to practice, and I felt bad for you because I knew you came from this broken home and there was no one there that could drive you to practice. And I always cared for you and I always thought about you. And Richard said in that moment that back then, when he was a young kid walking to baseball practice, growing up in this broken home, he felt like nobody saw him, that nobody cared for him. And now, 30 years later, to hear from the mother of the person that he murdered that she cared for him, that she saw him and witnessed him in that moment, just lifted this burden. And not only and I share this story with both of their permission, not only is that such an important story to remind us of what we are capable of as a species, we are capable of that depth of healing. It's a lot of work, I'm sure, that both of them had to do to get there, but we as a species are capable of that. We can bounce back from that. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is a paraphrase of Sobonfu Some, who said, conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen. Like through that extremely escalated conflict, they were actually able to deepen in relationship. That is possible, right? So that's important. But it's also important because, when the ultimate truth, when you go out into the universe, when you go out into space, there is no up or down, there is no right or wrong, there is no left or right or back or forward.
Right.
In this incident, it's Richard is the quote unquote perpetrator and Cynthia is the quote unquote victim or survivor. And in some ways, here was Cynthia holding space for Richard's healing. And if you look at healing in this linear way, and we oftentimes look at harm as this binary linear way, in this black and white way, you could say, wait, that's not how that's supposed to happen. Richard is supposed to be accountable to help Cynthia heal, but a lot of what I'm also offering in this book are these questions about, does the simple binary worldview of perpetrator and victim, right and wrong, actually create this delusion that harm is this simplistic black and white thing? And I write a lot about how a binary worldview, I think in so many ways is actually a violent worldview that is not true, that is not real, right? And so I think it's another a powerful story that reminds us that healing is not a linear process and it can happen in all directions. And when an incident of violence happens, it's never as clear as one person did the violence and the other person experienced it. We're all hurt by the dynamics of violence and we're all trying to heal from it. And I think that's an important thing to remember when we think about things like collective healing.
I've been finding that in spaces there's more opportunity for that to be uplifted, that everyone, everyone has been harmed in different ways.
Glad to hear that.
I'm curious, with you sharing that, what Cynthia said, I wanted to be in different relationship with the hands that killed my son. For you, what have you needed to in your journey be in different relationship with in order to engage in nonviolence while in the midst of these systems?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind is a few years ago, I was in a really, really escalated conflict. The hardest thing I've ever been through in my entire life since I was a child. And at the time, the people that I was in conflict with, it was very clear that they had shut the doors. They were not interested in having a real dialogue. And I felt like my body's need for relational healing just come up against a wall. And at the same time, I realized that this need for relational healing needed to happen somewhere. And so I reached out to a couple of friends of mine who are restorative justice facilitators and had them go looking for my old stepfather, who was like the source of a lot of our childhood violence at home that I was just mentioning earlier. And I hadn't seen him in 20 years or something. And I was like, I need this like relational healing energy to move in some direction. So I'm going to move it in that direction, just to move the energy and to try to change my relationship with him. Because I know that, you know, I've done a lot of healing with my family, still have a lot I need to do. But at least I've started some of those conversations with them. I've never talked to him, right? In fact, I still remember the last time I talked to him was a couple years after my mom got divorced, and I bumped into him in some shopping mall, and he came right up to me. I was like 19 or 20. He came right up to me, and I could see the tears in his eyes, and he said, "I never meant to hurt your family," which at the time was a little difficult to hear because I was like, "You, I don't know what that means because you clearly made decisions that did for many years." Um, and so at the time, as a 19, 20-year-old kid, I didn't know what to say, so I just turned around, didn't say anything to him, and walked away. And I, looking back on it, I regret that, and I want to redo that relationship. And so sadly, we found him, and I think it was in Arkansas or something like that. And as soon as we found him, he passed away. So I wasn't able to have that conversation with him. But even just the attempt to try to move in that direction meant that I had to have even deeper conversations with my own family and get their consent for me to reach out to him. And the internal journey that I had to have to explain to my facilitators why I wanted to have this conversation with him began to shift my relationship with him. And I could now see him not just as the person who caused so much harm, but like I see his face the last time I saw him at that mall, and like the tears welling up in his eyes. And I'm like, you were such a broken man that had so much hurt and didn't know what to do with it. And you needed to release it in some way. And you didn't have healthy avenues to release it. And it got released on us. Doesn't change any of what happened. Um, and I feel like just the process of me trying to change my relationship with them, even without that dialogue taking place, really did, you know, and that has helped me understand again, like in the law of fractals, what does that mean for my relationship with somebody like a Donald Trump, who is so easy for me to be like, F this person. Um, and at the same time, in the same way that I saw that trauma from my stepfather, like as someone that works with trauma, like it is so obvious to me that Trump is such a deeply traumatized person operating from a place of fear and insecurity and isolation. And while I will do everything I can to challenge everything he does, a part of me can begin to have more compassion for the place of emptiness that he is so clearly operating from. So yeah, like what can I do in my own personal life to change my relationship with even people like him? Yeah,
Thank you for sharing that story of your stepfather. My heart feels tender.
yeah, thank you.
Mm.
Tom Dostal was his name.
And it also leads me to think around ripples. We don't, that I guess that how do we continue? Because I don't think that you're alone in wanting to heal a relationship, and it's not
Sure.
possible in the human realm. And so less of a, it's a curiosity of how do we engage in this healing in many forms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember my first therapist once told me that sometimes our bodies have these like deeply felt emotions that are really confusing because they're not clearly attached to a story. Like if I can feel the shame that I still, you know, have little bits and pieces of from not being there for my family more. Like it makes sense to me, that feeling, because I can tie it to a story.
Right.
But there's oftentimes these feelings that we have that we can't immediately tie to a story. And oftentimes we don't know the story because it's not our harm, it's our ancestors' harm that
Right.
we've kind of adopted. And so we don't know what to do with that. And that doesn't mean that we don't have opportunities to work with that and to heal those wounds, right? And so I think, similar to my stepfather, like I may not be able to have the actual like in-person human conversation with them, but there's a lot that we can do to heal wounds with people that we don't have opportunities to talk to,
Right.
with people, ancestors that we've never known.
Right.
I just came out of one of the more powerful kind of rituals that I've been to in a long time was, I'm Japanese. I was born in Japan. And we had a healing ritual between several Japanese people and people of mostly Korean descent around the violence that my ancestors committed during World War II. And I wasn't around then. I don't know anyone that was directly impacted, and it was one of the most healing rituals I've ever been to. And so I think it's important to remember that you don't need the in-person dialogue to create healing.
Mm-hmm. I'm feeling our time coming to so unless we have a nonviolent approach to protesting.
Oh, we could
Yeah,
definitely just stay here for.
Yeah, there was a train that I jumped off. I've lost my train of thought.
There's other trains that we can hop on.
There are a lot of trains we could hop on. I think it's connected to what you were saying around that's what I was going to say, just to name that, the research epigenetics. That's what I was wanting to say, the research of epigenetics, that, and to plug somatic psychology and somatic practitioners, because that is a big part of the traumas being pre-verbal in the lineage. And how do we, even without a story, still touch in on the felt sense and the energy, because we know energy doesn't die, it moves.
That's right.
So how do we, and shame lives and breeds off of the silence. So how do we, either in our bodies or through words or movement, all of the ways, just begin moving the energy and creating the ripples?
Yeah, Brene Brown says shame derives its power from being unspoken.
Ooh, yeah.
When we don't speak to our shame, then it actually has more and more power over us. And actually, I'll also just share that the first therapist session I ever went to with my first therapist that I was just talking about, after the session, she goes, "You don't need therapy. You just need to learn to be in your body more." And so somatics has been a big journey for me as well.
Right, right. So we're coming close to time. Or coming close to questions. For everyone who has questions, please. I guess I just want to, we've journeyed in so many places in this hour. So I do want to see what hasn't been said that feels important to name in our time together today.
Yeah, there's a lot, but just given the time, I'll just share this, that I started doing nonviolence trainings when I was 19 years old, and at the time, those trainings were just like nonviolent civil disobedience trainings. I was preparing masses of people to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, risk arrest, all those things. So we would learn how to form blockades and work with the police and work with the media and lawyers and all that. And I think all of that is still important, but in doing this work of healing at scale, I think the importance of, like, if we are going to go out into the world, into demonstrations and lead with our vulnerability, then it is very possible that things might happen. Like, we might lead with our vulnerability and our open hearts, and we might get tear gassed and arrested, and that could be re-traumatizing. And so, one of the things that we're experimenting in Fierce Vulnerability is to lead demonstrations with our hearts wide open. But there's a beautiful quote from Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber, who says, "Preach from your scars, not from your wounds." And so the importance of doing healing work in our movement spaces, not so that we can feel like we are personally liberated, like I talk about how like individual liberation is a delusion. There's no such thing as individual liberation in an interdependent world. And so we do the work of personal healing so that we can be more grounded in these movement spaces so that we can offer more healing to the world. And so I like so much of the important the work that we're talking about in fierce vulnerability is the undeniable connection between personal training and systemic personal transformation and systemic transformation,
Mhm.
and to not think that like I can just do my therapy over here just for my own benefit, or I can do social change work and not look at my own shadows, because if we're not doing one or the other, we're always going to be spinning our wheels.
Mm-hmm. That feels like a good um, takeaway to begin closing. Um, I want to, before we take questions, just thank you for this time, for hearing my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation too.
Yeah, let's clap. Yes. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you.
Question from the audience. I'm curious how to work with someone, not necessarily therapeutically, but in relationship generally, who's carrying that shutdown energy in activist spaces coming from their own experience of trauma and hurt and
Yeah.
fear. You just spoke to that around the scar, not the wound.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm always talking about too is the importance of movement spaces to create more and more explicit spaces to honor, to witness, and to express grief and rage. Because I think oftentimes the rage that gives rise to that shutdown energy is 100% legitimate, right? Like there are so many things that are happening in the world today that we should be pissed off about. And if we don't, like, I think there's another really dangerous misunderstanding about nonviolence, is that like nonviolence is about teaching people not to be angry. That's not true. It's about like channeling the right type of anger in the right direction. And I think oftentimes when we witness injustice, when we experience violence, when we experience trauma, there's so much anger that comes out of that. And that anger is a gift, it is righteous. But oftentimes what happens is that anger arises at the same time as hatred and resentment. And so if we can do the work of giving safe spaces for us to express our blind rage and just let it out, then it becomes easier to discern and to separate out the hatred and resentment from the anger. And then that anger can actually become a powerful force for change. And so I think if, a lot of people are moving with the shutdown energy, and it's because they are rightfully angry, and to honor and to create space for that anger to be witnessed so that it can then be channeled in the right directions, I think.
Yeah. Anger being powerful when we learn how to wield it.
Absolutely.
I don't know if this lands, but I'm also hearing in that the person in relationship with this person, with the anger, how to develop the capacity to hold the space, trusting that it'll come their time to share whatever grievances they have, but to be able to hold the space, which can be difficult if the grievances are on both ends potentially.
It's very difficult, and I also know that like my one of my habits is like fix it energy. So if like someone is expressing anger, I have a tendency to want to fix it for them, and like well, if you do this, you won't be so angry or whatever it is. And so I have to often catch myself. There's a thing that we say in a lot of jam spaces is when we are hearing someone sharing their stories and expressing their emotions, to not jiff, which is an acronym JIFF.
Okay.
So don't judge them, don't interpret their story, don't fix them, and don't freeze them in that moment. So if they're expressing anger in that moment, they're angry in that moment. That's not the total sum of who they are. It's just like a small dip in the river of their life. And so I really have to always remind myself when people are expressing like difficult emotions, powerful emotions, I oftentimes like things come up for me and I get defensive and I start jiffing. And so noticing when I'm doing that and just learning to create space for their emotions, for their stories, for their experiences, just to be witnessed.
I love that takeaway. Jif,
Yeah.
do you have advice on how to broach topics like collective healing, grief, and trauma with audience that value pragmaticism and suppress vulnerability?
Mm. Um, so, I mentioned that I work a lot with incarcerated people, particularly incarcerated men, who have been taught for decades to suppress their vulnerability. And again, I think one of the most powerful things is when we, as facilitators, including, I work a lot with incarcerated facilitators, do our own work enough so that we can model the vulnerability. And once someone models vulnerability, it just like creates possibilities that weren't there in the first place. But again, I think the really important thing is like building up those scars around those wounds, because if I'm in a circle and I model vulnerability, and that vulnerability, that vulnerable thing that I share puts me into panic, then I'm now creating a situation where they have to take care of me. And
Uh-huh.
so, am I doing my own work enough to know how to touch into enough of my own vulnerability as a gift and medicine to the group, but not something that puts myself into it? So, like, what are the stories that I've actually processed and healed and integrated enough that can help create a vulnerable space in the community that I'm in, without putting myself too far into panic?
Right, right. Okay. I'm appreciating this question, the honesty in the question. Sorry if this is answered with read about it in the book, but I was hoping you could spend a little time offering guidance on how someone could get started building an interdependent community,
Mm,
a fractal,
mm,
when we don't have those foundational relationships yet
yeah,
outside of our immediate family or our partner.
yeah.
So
Um,
community.
One thing I think to start as the baseline foundation, not to say that it's easy, but to remember that you are already in an interdependent community, right?
Mm,
Like, I truly believe that the universe, this is one of the universal laws of our galaxy, of our existence, is that we live in an interdependent universe. There's the how the universe is structured. And I oftentimes talk about how, universal laws of nature, like there are people in the world who don't believe that gravity is a real thing. There are
mm,
people who believe that the earth is flat and gravity is not real. And it doesn't matter that they don't believe in it, because it is a universal law of nature and they're still governed by its laws.
mhm,
So there are people who don't believe that we are interdependent. There are moments where I forget that I'm interdependent. But at the end of the day, there is nothing outside of interdependence.
mhm,
So I think the more that we can remember that we are already interdependent, the easier it becomes to begin to build communities that reflect that and that model that. And I'll also share, the impossible pace of capitalism is not conducive to building these interdependent communities. I oftentimes think about how so many times when I'm going throughout my workday, we'll go to a business meeting or whatever, and we just like jump straight into the agenda, and we don't slow down and say, "Hey, how are you doing?"
right.
And also like the "How are you?" is a useless question that no one ever actually means.
Mhm,
And so little things like actually asking people, how are you doing? And giving them that space to actually ask themselves, actually, how am I doing in this moment, goes such a long ways. And we just don't do that enough. And so I think there's ways in which, all of this work of building community and social change and all that, there's a level of it in which it's really complicated and you've got to build all these strategies and all that. But there's also I think, a deeper level of truth that like this work is actually really, really simple.
mhm.
It's as simple as, can we slow down enough to check in and ask each other how we're doing? And I think the more we build in these small practices throughout our days, the easier it becomes to start to see more and more communities like this manifest.
Mhm. Kind of like that. You're already home.
Yeah.
You're already home. And as we're doing it on these small scales at the grocery store, making eye contact, it's so interesting to walk in the streets now and everyone's heads down. Like
Oh
even the
God.
attempt to make eye contact
Yeah.
is efforted.
Yeah. Totally.
Um, Here's a fun question. What has been the most surprising, rewarding, and most challenging in writing the book?
In writing the book, I think the most challenging thing is I really feel like fierce vulnerability is like it's not something I own. Like I'm never gonna make the trademarks for it. Like I think it's a living thing. It's not something I created. And so like knowing when to stop,
Mhm.
because like every 6 months, I'm like, oh, I understand this to be a completely different thing now and I have to rewrite the
Oh,
entire book.
right.
And so how do I put something that is a living, growing, evolving thing into a book
Right.
and say this is what it is without saying that this is what it is, because and so I think how do I honor the emergence of this thing called fierce vulnerability while like putting it into a book. What like this book was supposed to come out like 3 years ago. So I think that part of it is like honoring that fierce vulnerability is not something I created, it's a thing that lives on its own. And how do I, as the person that whose name is on the cover, honor its own life and its
Mm-hmm.
own journey. Um, and I think one of the most surprising gifts is that, there's a lot of like personal stories in the book, and how difficult and how healing it was to try to put it down on paper, because it required me to have even more conversations with my family. It's like, hey, I'm gonna write about this thing in a book that's going out. Are you okay if I talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
And so even just the process of writing it has brought me so much healing. So that was such a gift.
Beautiful. Um, Another person says they loved that you were talking about scaling personal transformation into societal transformation. And they're curious if you have any thoughts on how technology could help to scale.
Oh God. Okay. One of the people that I look up to the most right now is a woman named Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who wrote Hospicing Modernity.
Hmm.
Um, and the whole book is about this idea that like the system of modernity as we know it is in a state of collapse. Everything we think we know about the world is in a state of collapse. And as this indigenous like scholar who wrote this book, she's super into AI right now.
Hmm.
And she has this whole thing that like I had an opportunity to spend a couple days with her recently, and she was telling me that she's been training this AI with this understanding that AI is ultimately like a computer chip, and computer chips are ultimately made out of Earth's minerals. And so she feels like if she brings the right intention into it, she's actually communicating with the Earth's minerals,
Oh,
which like was like, wait, what? I was so anti AI until I heard this, and I'm still really questioning it though, because a
good.
lot of the book is actually about there's another like delusion of progress, right? And
Mm-hmm.
actually Vanessa writes about it in her book too. I think what we need to be doing right now as a species is going backwards and like remembering what it means to
Remembering.
be human,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think we have forgotten what it means to be human largely because of technology. And every time I think I read about this in my book too, like hanging my clothes out to dry in the sun has become a really important spiritual practice for me,
Mm.
because when I can feel the weight of the wet clothes in my hand and the warmth of the sun behind my back, knowing that that's the warmth that's going to dry my clothes, knowing that this is something that my ancestors have been doing for so much longer than dryers have been around,
Mm-hmm.
it just slows me down and connects me to my ancestors in a way that reading about my ancestors on an article on my phone will never do. And I think there's something so important about practices that remind us how to be human again. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually afraid that technology is doing the opposite of that. So you know, I have more technology now, but because I have a child, but before our child was born, like my partner actually got rid of their cell phone,
Well,
and I was using this thing called I forgot what it was called. It was like this like black and white phone that can only make phone calls and text messages. And we have to do a little bit, we decided to do a little bit more now because we have a child. But yeah, I think low tech slows me down in a way that I find to be really grounding. So yeah, that's how I'd respond to that.
Yeah, there's something just around being able to come back to the earth. And you keep using the word remembering.
Yeah.
Remembering. Can you say more about JAMS and what they are?
Yeah.
What does it stand for?
It's not an acronym. The JAMs are these week-long retreats that are organized by a group called YES. It's yesworld.org. It's linked in my book. So YES started out as YES is an acronym. It stands for Youth for Environmental Sanity. It used to be a youth environmental organization that used to have these retreats for young environmental activists. And these retreats were so powerful that they actually decided to focus their organizational resources on organizing these retreats and less on environmental stuff. And so now jams happen all over the world, like all throughout the year. They are some of the most transformative. Like, if you want to experience in an embodied way an interdependent community, there are very few communities who do it better consistently, time and time and time again. My partner and I are part of the Asian Diaspora Jam team. There's the Black Diaspora Jam, there's the Queer Jam, there's the Artist Jam for artists, there's the Healing and Wellness Justice Jam for healers, there's the Law Jam for legal professionals. There's all these jams, and they're called jams because they're modeled after a musician's jam. We actually don't have an agenda when we show up at this like week-long
Oh, I
retreat.
love it.
We really try to like feel what is the need of the group in each moment and adjust based on that. And it's an awesome experience. So yeah, if you have a chance, yesworld.org.
Yesworld.org. How important is it for us to ask people we're in relationship with to go on a healing journey as well?
I am so grateful that my partner has done more work on their healing than most people I know. There's a marriage therapist, a marriage counselor that I used to do a lot of work with in Seattle, and she once said that there's one question that she asks every couple that she works with, and that is, how does your partner's trauma show up in your relationship, and can you live with that?
Yes.
Because in every relationship, especially the more intimate it gets, and I'm not talking about like romantic, but like the closer you are to that person, the more that stuff's gonna come up. So like, how does that come up? Does it impact your relationship in a way that is actually gonna like be a hindrance? And if it is, then you absolutely need to work together on healing, and you absolutely need to invite that person into a healing relationship. And I think, my partner Li Chen says that creating a safe space is not about creating a place where people don't experience harm. It's about creating a space where people feel safe enough to re-engage with their harm. And I think relationships, community is that, right? It's about creating space, not to be like, you need to go to therapy and deal with it, which might be an important part of the equation. I love my therapist. I love therapy, would recommend it for everyone. And I think there's value in creating a safe container in the field of your relationship, so that that relationship can also become a place where healing happens.
Thank you. I'm seeing these questions and I want to check in with you. How are you doing?
Oh, cool. Yeah,
You're up for more questions?
yeah, sure. Yeah.
How are y'all doing? More questions? Okay.
My watch is broken, so I don't even know what time it is.
It's
so.
fancy though.
Yeah, I just broke it.
You strike me as a storyteller and someone who lets stories move you. Have you always felt this, even as a kid?
I never felt it until I started becoming a trainer, and it just like happened organically. I will say that if you had met me as a kid or like in my early teens, I was the most shut down person you will have ever met in your entire life. Like, I was completely broken, completely shut down, never said a word. So I was definitely not a storyteller. But as I started doing this work and becoming a trainer and then going through my own healing journey and understanding my own story, it just organically emerged. And I really do believe as a trainer, like people don't remember theory, they remember stories, right? And so I think it's really important to be able to always tie theory to stories. And I also know that, like, for me, being able to share my story it's such a gift because it supports me in my own healing journey and understanding my own story better. And so, like the story with Cynthia and Richard, like healing is not this like one way thing that like one person gives to another person. Every time I tell my story, I get to learn and I get to heal from that. So it's really a
Right.
gift.
Right. How do you experience joy? And what clues tell you joy is being experienced as a collective? That's an interesting question.
Hold on. This, it'll be worth it, I promise. Come on. That's my 1-year-old. Um, yeah, that's the most obvious
Baby
thing.
laughs.
Oh my God.
Oh
And
my
I
goodness.
like, she just turned 1 yesterday when I was sharing. And like a year into it, every time I see her smile,
Mm.
it is the most amazing moment of my life. And so that's the obvious thing. But I think also like uh, uh, someone that I was working with years ago told me once that I should be careful saying things like I'm upset or I'm depressed or things like that because I may be experiencing depression, but if I say I am depressed,
Oh, yeah.
there are moments of joy throughout that journey of depression that I will just bypass and miss. And so I think I really try to, as much as possible, be present to every like when I'm in a meditation retreat, every time I take a sip of water, it's like, oh my God, this water tastes amazing.
Hmm.
Or when I go to Deer Park Monastery, it's a monastery outside San Diego, like they have the best steamed broccoli in the world. And so it's like, if we can slow down enough, there are moments of joy throughout our day, and really trying to capture those moments too, I think is really important.
Right. What I learned is anything that we attach to I am,
Yeah,
because our words have power.
totally. Yeah,
So to I am,
yeah,
to choose those words wisely.
yeah.
And um, uh, IFS or parts work also
I love
speaks to this, to
IFS.
be able
Yeah,
to say, there is an aspect of me that is experiencing
yeah,
fill in the blank.
absolutely. Yeah,
It leaves room, it takes away the binary that you're speaking to, and it leaves room for me to be that multifaceted, complex
right.
person that we know ourselves to be, but our words have such power. We
Yeah,
can wield them, and oftentimes we're unconsciously wielding them
yeah,
to our detriment.
yeah. No, language creates our world in so many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, man.
Mm-hmm. Who has taught you to be fiercely vulnerable? And who do you look to when you've lost your compass?
Huh. I oftentimes credit my mom in so many ways. She was not an activist or anything like that, but like I always used to make fun of her for being this like hippie spiritual new age person. But she, growing up surrounded me with indigenous elders and teachings about forgiveness and oneness and all that. And so, even before I had any sort of like political awakening, she really sowed the seeds. So I think she's, I talked about this in my first book, like she's my first teacher. Even though, like it's still hard with her sometimes, and that's a teaching too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the book I dedicated to 4 people. It's Shilpa Jain, who is the longtime executive director of Yes and is the person that introduced me to jams. Sonia Shah, who is the founder of the Ahimsa Collective, who introduced me to restorative justice work in the prisons. My friend Chris Moore Backman, who I was hoping to work with for the rest of my life. He's one of the most committed practitioners of nonviolence I've ever known. And then my partner, Lee Tsen Wong. I think those 4 people really taught me what fierce vulnerability is.
Mm. Beautiful. And if I can also just what you named around you spoke to the experiences that were harmful or hurtful or traumatizing as a child. And if we just blanket our entire childhood with the trauma, that you would have missed those nuggets of beauty that mom also
totally.
brought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, like even Tom, right? My stepfather, like there were beautiful moments in our relationship, right? And the pain that he caused doesn't have to negate the beauty, and the beauty also doesn't negate the harm, and it doesn't condone any of what he did, right?
Hmm. All of it's possible at
All
the
of it,
same
yeah.
time. Last question.
All right.
I promise. In an imagination land, we're gonna end in imagination land, dreamscape. What would the world look like if each person led with a heart of fierce vulnerability?
Mm,
What would you say?
um, I hate to say it, but the first thing that came up is that the Celtics will win the world championship every year.
Okay.
This is a theme in my books too. We're down 0-2 right now. I was talking to my partner just recently, just today, like how some of the truest truths that we have come to understand in the world is so cheesy and cliche. And I really coming to what's coming to mind is John Legend's song Imagine.
Mm.
And just like one of the kind of deeper truths that I mentioned in the book is like, as I don't know what um, freedom for Palestine means, as someone who believes that the idea of a nation state is a form of violence, and so like Palestinian people having their own nation state, two-state solution, one-state solution, like those are all state solutions. And so I was talking to my friend Sujatha about this, and she was like, I believe in a world where we all live in completely autonomous, decentralized, small village structures where each person has a real community that knows them and is known by them. And I think to me, that is like the vision of the world that I want to live in, is where everyone has a deep community, that not just like community of people that I'm friends with on Facebook or like I haven't seen in a long time, but I really love them, but like people who you live with, that you see every day, that knows you and that sees you. And so this is, I'm kind of going on a bit of an aside, but like I have this whole thing about I don't care about who becomes president. I want to abolish the office of the presidency because I just don't believe in the centralization of power. And I think in a world where each person can really fulfill their own potential, there's going to be so many empowered people that we will have less and less of a need for centralized leadership, and we'll have more and more decentralized communities that are small enough where we all actually get to know each other and love each other in a way that we all deserve, So it sounds cheesy in some ways, but
Something beautiful to hold on to.
yeah.
Well, this concludes our time, and I'd really love to, in what you just said, I see you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution, for your work, past, present, and future. And I'm calling in that dream too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Appreciate you all.